Greetings. I'm Largo. This is The Lair, and today we're going to revisit an old friend, someone I have done a little bit of looking into as I reviewed some toys about this particular baddie recently. But now we're going to delve a little bit more into some of the lore, as we tend to do here at The Lair. And to do that, I've asked a friend of mine who is also a big fan of this particular baddie to join us. So let me introduce him. How goes it, sir?
Thank you. It's good. It's good. Thank you very much for that beautiful intro. I absolutely adored it.
Well, good. I always want to make sure people understand that our guests are special here. So I like to do the little intros.
Humble.
Plus, it's a nice touch to let people know where BobaHicks comes from. So
Yeah,
it's a nice little tie-in. We had a great time talking about the Predator last time we sat and had one of these sessions. And so today we will be chatting about another great baddie from the movies, the Terminator. So what was your first interest in this? Did you see the film when it first came out, or were you a wee bit young for that?
yeah. So I was a wee bit young to see it in the cinema, definitely. But as with most of these movies, it was quick to find its way into my house on VHS. My father had a taped copy of it. I watched it. I loved it, while also being simultaneously terrified by it.
Yeah, it began this and a few others. There was like with Alien, which we've also talked about, Terminator, The Predator. They were R-rated films. They were meant for adults, but they really struck a chord with kids. And as we'll see, there's a lot of toys that came from that. So it's a very interesting thing that happened in the 80s where a lot of R-rated properties became merchandised to younger audiences, which is just kind of odd. I'd say, yeah, the ones we've listed, RoboCop would probably fall under that as well.
Yes.
There's probably a few others. That may be a whole nother rabbit hole for us to go down one of these days. But let's talk about this particular baddie today. So there's Arnold striking his mean mug pose. He was really well cast for this. He wasn't well known as an actor at this point. I mean, he'd done a few things, but he was mostly known for having a really good physique. And I don't know if he had won Mr. Olympian at this point. Probably. I didn't follow his career that closely, but he was well known as a bodybuilder and was trying to break into acting. So this was, I think this was his big break that got him into larger roles down the road. So this was 1984 when this was released. Of course, it is a media franchise now. James Cameron created this with Gail Ann Hurd, and it encompasses not just the films, but comics, novels, video games, T-shirts, merchandising. It's all over the place. It's become pop culture, and it's all about the core story is about the war between Skynet and the Resistance, and how that plays out in the future war. So the official ballywick for the first film, I'll try to put my announcer voice on for this. An almost indestructible cyborg killing machine is sent from 2029 to 1984. It has been programmed to execute a young woman whose unborn son is the key to humanity's future salvation.
Excellent rundown there.
I
Imagine
love that
reading that
picture.
for the first time back in the day. I'd probably have read that blurb and been like, what the hell is this about?
Yeah. And again, like a lot of great science fiction, this didn't seem familiar at all. Of course, we'll learn it was a little more familiar than people think. There had been hints of this before. Great picture of Arnie. He never actually looked like that in the film that I remember. He always had,
Right.
this
It
was just
seems
for the
like
promo shots.
the pistol is the one he uses in the techno or disco that he gets from the gun shop, but the jacket and haircut and glasses are from later on in the movie when you see him in the police station. So I think they must have taken a few
Yeah.
stills and amalgamated them together. But it's so iconic, brilliant poster. It looks
Oh yeah.
fantastic.
It when you got a chest like Arnie's, you don't want to cover it up. They wanted to show his beefiness, so I can understand them putting that on the movie poster. So really, the first film, we're going to be focusing mostly on the baddie himself, the Terminator, but you got to have it in context. So for those who've been sleeping under a rock, Sarah Connor was the intended target of our cyborg killer. She lived an ordinary life, pretty plain Jane. But everything that Sarah had ever known was to change on May 12th, 1984. Sarah found herself pursued by a relentless cyborg killer, the Terminator, a Series 800, also known as a Model 101 infiltrator. This unit was after her for reasons completely unknown to her until she meets Kyle Reese. And of course, the big reason, John Connor. And I would have loved to have seen Michael Edwards do more as John Connor. I would have loved to have seen him do a whole side film of just the future war with him, but it just wasn't in the cards. But I thought he made a great John Connor in the few seconds we got of him in the flashbacks. So
Definitely looked the part.
oh yeah, they really did him up well. And for this wasn't a huge budget film. So I can understand why filming, the future battles, they had to kind of use a lot of smoke and mirrors, literally, to just kind of give the impression of how things were in the apocalyptic future of 2029. So John was a messianic figure born on February 28th, 1985, according to the original timeline. And timelines get screwy later on. We'll talk about that. He was the one who will lead the resistance to defeat an empire of robotic Terminators amassed by the rogue military AI Skynet, following a cybernetic revolt doomsday event known as Judgment Day. So, according to the original canon, this is how it played out.
The only canon I need.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of biased in my opinion of where the films went, but the first film is great, and I think, my opinion, and you may agree, I know some do. Basically, the first two films they should have just called it quits. That's where the timeline ends. That's what Cameron initially meant. He meant for the film to be finished in T2. So, but they sure like to just drag things out to diminishing returns. Ironically, this I did not know. I don't know if you knew this. When I was doing some research on this, I found an interview with Cameron in 2021. and he mentioned that the song Russians by Sting was the inspiration for John Connor. Did you know that?
I did not know this. I actually did not know this.
Here's the story. According to James Cameron, I remember sitting there once high on E, writing notes for Terminator, and I was struck by Sting's song that I hope the Russians love their children too. And I thought, you know what? The idea of a nuclear war is just so antithetical to life itself. And that's where the kid came from. So deep, man.
And yeah,
In
I'll
our
have to
input,
take a note of
talk about
maybe
how
try
all
some E.
yeah, well, yeah. I mean, whatever gets the creative juices flowing. Even Stephen
Exactly, yeah.
King was known for his recreational pharmaceuticals from time to time. But like I was saying, the Infinite Playlist, we talk about how music inspires a lot of people in their life. And one of our most iconic sci-fi characters came from the inspiration of Sting doing his song about nuclear war
Awesome.
or the potential of it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I did not know that before. But with that, Skynet came online. Ominous music insert here. Dum dum dum. So that is the official logo for Skynet Research. I did not know that either, but apparently there is a logo. So that's kind of what the conceptual idea of Skynet is that whatever that is, kind of like the all-seeing eye, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so.
So in the original 1984 movie, the character Kyle Reese, also lovingly known as Corporal Hicks later on, one of your favorite characters, played by the great Michael, is it Bain or Bean? How do you pronounce the last name?
I've always said it Bine, Michael
Bine.
Bine.
Fair
I'm
enough.
sure it could be completely wrong. That's
Tomatoes,
always how I've
tomatoes.
said it. Exactly.
Either way, he's a great actor. I saw him do some interviews talking about his time on Tombstone, and he's just a man's man. He's one of those guys who's like, hey, I'm here to work. Let's do the film. Let's get on with it. It's like, cool. So I imagine he was probably the same way when he was doing Kyle Reese. Very early in his career. Great job. He really could have done a whole movie of his own with that character. He really put some passion into it. But Kyle explains Skynet to us. He gives us the idea of what's going on when he's explaining this to Sarakana. So he explains that the Skynet is a defense network of computers, something new, powerful, hooked into everything, trusted to run it all. They say it got smart. A new order of intelligence. So according to Reese, Skynet saw all humans as a threat, not just the ones on the other side, and decided our fate in a microsecond. Extermination. Began a nuclear war which destroyed most of the human population and initiated a program of genocide against what survivors there were. Then Skynet used its resources to gather a slave labor force from surviving humans. So it's pretty bleak. I mean, there had been a lot of post-apocalyptic sci-fi prior to this. Pre-Star Wars, that was kind of a theme. There was a lot of, with Planet of the Apes and other popular franchises. It was all about we're either going to blow ourselves up or something catastrophic is going to happen. And this kind of followed that same thread of we are too smart for our own good. We're going to create something wonderful in AI that's going to turn around and bite us.
It's a little bit like Logan's Run as well. It's I think there was some type of nuclear catastrophe which causes all humans to have to live inside a domed city, but that domed city is controlled by an AI. So
Right.
it's that, after this it's that kind of theme, I suppose, that after our almost assured destruction, we become dependent on this omnipotent machine to either spare us or destroy us.
Yeah, definitely a trope of 70s and 80s sci-fi. And it's now that we're actually seeing AI come about in real life, it's darkly humorous to see how people's fears might be somewhat realized in some of these AIs, where they learn at an exponential rate, a scary rate. And I don't know how plugged in they are, but I can imagine that we could definitely create quite the mess for ourselves if we're not careful. So, but the ones that are the culprits in this, I guess it's a multiverse. It kind of is when you count all the multiple timelines. But in the Terminator universe, they were originally created by Cyberdyne Systems and then put at the disposal of the AI Skynet. And then, of course, when it rebelled, it wiped out the remnants of humanity. Skynet apparently found a way to automate the Cyberdyne assembly lines to continue to create new and more horrific Terminator models. So a lot of that's still kind of murky, but it has been explored in some of the novels and comics and things we'll talk about a little bit later. But Cyberdyne, it was always there lurking in the background, even in the first film, which a lot of people don't realize. So you had been mentioning something about that earlier. Maybe you'd elaborate for our people at home.
We've been discussing briefly the end of the first movie. So after Sarah Connor has defeated the Terminator, which she accomplishes. Spoiler alert, folks. Sorry, I know it's been a while since the movie's been released, but Sarah Connor manages to take down the Terminator by crushing it in a, I suppose, a press machine in a factory. And in the cut of the film that most of us have seen, that scene ends with her being taken out of the factory, loaded into an ambulance, and driven away. However, there is an extended version of that scene which you can see on the DVD special features, which essentially shows the camera kind of pulls back from the scene of the crime, so to speak, and you get to see that the factory where all the action is taking place in is actually a Cyberdyne building, and actually you can see the name Cyberdyne above the entrance. So Cameron was thinking ahead. He definitely was thinking ahead in that instance. So yeah, in a strange twist of fate, or maybe it's one of those, as they say in Star Trek, a temporal paradox. The Terminator ended up finding its way home to the Cyberdyne factory, and
Right.
and
Definitely
being laid to
a
rest there to be found.
yeah, a chicken or egg kind of conundrum. It's like, which came first? So that makes so much more sense. I wish they had put that into the theatrical release because I wasn't aware of that. But it makes sense that the factory where they had their final battle was owned by Cyberdyne, and they were the ones who found the arm and the remains of the Terminator, and then reverse engineered it, as we saw in T2. So makes a lot of sense. I wonder how much of T2 Cameron already had written, or had parts that he couldn't put in the first film. He knew he was going to do a sequel. It's something to delve on
I had
to.
read that when he originally started to come up with the concept of Terminator, and specifically the concept of sending a Terminator back through time, I think I'd read before that he had actually came up with the idea of a liquid metal robot that could change form, but he parked that idea to one side because he just knew there was no chance of the technology being available just to pull off something like that on screen. So he definitely obviously kept that idea and brought it forward to T2. So there was definitely at least some elements of what would become T2 already in his mind when he was doing T1.
Yeah, to his credit, I mean, what they were able to do with Stan Winston's endoskeleton puppet that he created was terrifying at the time. Some of the stop motion wasn't great. It doesn't age well, but you suspend your disbelief because it's a good story. But even for 1984, it was pretty good special effects, and some of the scenes, the way they did it with the physical model on set, it was scary. When I remember first seeing the film, I was a little freaked out by it. What did
Same
you
here.
find it? I was going to say, did you find it hokey or was it scary when you first saw it?
Well, the first movie really kind of, as a kid, like I said, like I really loved it, but it definitely got to me in other ways for scaring the you know what out of me. Especially two things that really jumped out at me as a kid watching it. That apart from the Terminator at the end actually chasing down Reese and Sarah in the factory, the stop motion actually made it more scary for me
Because of the
because
jerkiness of it?
the jerkiness of it and the way you'd seen already earlier in the movie, when he still had his Arnold skin on, his leg had been injured, so he had a bit of a limp anyway. And then to see that kind of jerking, I didn't even notice that it was a kind of stop motion. It seemed like a natural way for something like that to move, and I just found it terrifying, especially when there's a brief moment where the two of them are running down the corridor. It seems to be catching up with them, and they just
Right.
managed to get the door slammed right before it reaches them. Like that, I literally jumped at that moment. As a kid, I remember being like, "Whoa, that was a little bit too close for comfort for me."
Yeah, that to me was the terrifying thing is it feels, like Kyle Reese, his little monologue is like it doesn't feel pain. It you can't reason with it. It doesn't know pity. It just keeps coming until it finishes what it's meant to do, and it's meant to kill you. So that's what made it terrifying. Is an enemy that you couldn't reason with, you couldn't easily kill. It was just this oncoming thing. But for a brief moment, even as a kid, I was like, "Hey, hey, hey, that's stop motion." I'd seen too many Harryhausen monster films, so my brain was like, I know what that is. That's stop motion." But it didn't spoil it for me. I was still enjoying the film. But that brings us to the baddie that we're here to talk about, the Terminator. He officially is in the multiverse of Terminators, a cyborg assassin. Considered a cyborg because even though it's a robot, he has a nice fleshy shell on some of the later models. So that's why he is considered such. Even though it is a synthetic flesh, it is cloned meat. That's what's for dinner, probably. That or Soylent Green, one of the two. The future. So this cyborg assassin and soldier was designed for infiltration and combat duty, used by the military supercomputers Skynet towards the ultimate goal of exterminating the human resistance. So there were a couple of earlier models that get mentioned. Briefly, Kyle kind of runs over them, but he doesn't go into detail. Of course, in the novelization, there's talk of them, and in the other media that comes out later, we see some of these. So the T500 is one of the earliest models that we actually see described in any kind of real detail. It was the last of the ones that went from just being a hunter killer in a humanoid form to being the endoskeletons that came later. So this was kind of like that in between model. This was featured in one of the video games at least, and in some of the novelizations as well. And kind of clunky, but still scary. It was more akin, I guess, to like a Cylon Raider than a.
I was just thinking that I'm seeing a little
Yeah,
bit of Cylon, a little bit of C3PO.
yeah, very. Yeah, I definitely see some Cylon there. You just give him a red eye going back and forth, and you're there. But still, again, a machine that just doesn't quit. After that, again, Skynet is a learning machine and it keeps improving. So next was the T600. This was the first true infiltrator unit, and it didn't meet with great success because it was still bulky. It was a little larger than a human. And also, their first attempt at a skin job was rubber. They just put like a rubber suit on it. So at a distance, it looked humanoid, but as soon as it got close, people knew what it was. So this also was one of the reasons they started using dogs, because dogs could definitely tell there was something unnatural going on. And it was still quite a problem for the resistance, but not as much as this bad boy. This was the one that really terrified the resistance. So these were made in multiple models or versions. The straight soldier, they didn't bother with the covering on them. They just put them out as the endoskeleton and used them as soldiers. No pity, no pain, no fear, something unstoppable. And just a very terrifying design. And I, I really enjoy how this was put together. I don't know how much of this was Stan Winston's creativity or how much of this was James Cameron's telling him what he wanted, but the end result is fascinating and terrifying.
Teeth always bothered me. They're really freaky. It's just really freaky to see a completely metallic face with human looking teeth. It's very disturbing when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. Because that would have been one of the few things that would have remained even if they didn't have the flesh covering. So, yeah, that is creepy. So, the T-800 Terminator models are designed to masquerade as humans in order to infiltrate their bases and habitats. They are metallic endoskeletons covered with a synthetic human flesh. And of course, one of the most popular models that we know is the Arnold. I don't know if he had a code name. I don't know if in the books they ever called this model something other than T800 or the um, what was it they called him? The model
101.
101. But I'm sure he had some sort of a name they gave him, like Biff or John or whatever. There were brief glimpses of, I can't remember if it was in the original film, because, after a while the mind muddies, you see so many different things. Terminator. There were other versions of the T-800 that were shown that they used some other
That's
big
right.
muscly guys. Was there in the first film? Was there another Terminator that was shown
There
in like the
was.
flashback?
That's right. And when we were speaking earlier about the endoskeleton chasing Reese and Sarah in the factory, I mentioned that as one of the two kind of terrifying bits. The other terrifying bit for me as a child was actually that scene where it's a future flashback, if that makes sense to anybody who's watching,
Right.
but where Reese is remembering when their base was infiltrated by a Terminator who essentially takes out everybody in the base. He kills everybody, but the Terminator in that scene was played by, I think, the guy who was Arnie's stunt double on set. So he was a big muscly guy, similar physique to Arnie. Doesn't look too much like him facially, but you definitely can see watching the movie that it's a different guy. It's not supposed to be Arnold in that scene. It's showing you that, look, these Terminators, they can look different. They'll have different faces and different appearances. Um, yeah, a terrifying scene. That moment, the dogs start barking, and the
Yep.
Terminator pushes the guys out of the way and just whips out his big laser cannon and starts cutting loose. It always
Yeah.
stuck with me, especially since he's walking down a dark corridor, so you only see his shadowy silhouette, and then the two red eyes kind of shining
Yeah.
through the face.
That was well done. And again, using, the shadows and the silhouettes and not showing everything, but leaving to your imagination. That was probably another thing that made it a little more scary. But yeah, so the model that showed up in 1984 just happened to look like this. It could have been any other big beefy guy. It had to be big enough to cover the endoskeleton, so that's why they explained that the human skins tended to be, big buff Austrian types. So the final chapter of the first film could be titled Terminator Plagiarism. When Harlan Ellison watched the film, he stated he loved it. He said, "I love the movie. I was just blown away by it." But uh, he believed that the screenplay was based on a short story and episode of The Outer Limits he had written titled Soldier. I've seen Soldier, and I definitely understand where he's coming from. The premise of that story, tell me if you've heard this before. A soldier from the future is sent to the past to stop something from happening that creates a doomsday in the future. Yeah, so
Very familiar.
very familiar. And Harlan Ellison's like, hey, man, I wrote this way back in the 60s. So he threatened to sue for infringement. And Orion, who owned the property at the time, did a settlement in 1986 and gave Ellison an undisclosed amount of money, which I assume was quite a lot, and added an acknowledgement credit to later prints of the film. So They never officially said, yes, this was borrowed heavily from your story, but they just said, look, we'll just give you some of the profits and we'll just make this thing go away. So it's a Hollywood thing.
There's,
But
and look, I'm sure any similarities were purely coincidental.
of course, of course, I'm sure James Cameron came up with all of that on his own without watching any late night telly and seeing any Outer Limits episodes. That didn't happen, as he was high on E. Anyway, T2, my favorite, the favorite of many, and probably one of the top 5 sci-fi movies ever made. It is considered one of the best films ever made by many of the critics, and one of the best science fiction, action, and sequel films, as well as equal to or better than the original Terminator. It is also seen as one of the most influential visual effects films of all time. The first film was pretty groundbreaking with what Stan Winston did with that endoskeleton. The second film, with the liquid metal and some of the shots and effects, totally mind blowing. And they won some awards for this, for not only the transitioning from practical effects into CGI, but just the way things were filmed. This was the infancy of CGI. Now it's overused to the point of absurdity, but then it was a new technology, and they were trying to make it look as good on film as they could, and they did a great job. What did you think of could you tell the CGI where it started? For me, it was really hard to tell when the practical effects stopped and the CGI began. And some of it you could, but some of it was trippy.
I thought it was phenomenal, and I actually even think, to this day, it's nearly watertight. It's very hard to poke any holes in the effects of T2, whether they be the practical effects or the CGI effects. And the liquid Terminator, the T1000, I'm sure we'll get to him later, but it was the perfect, it was the perfect way to display this new technology when you literally have a character whose whole form can meld and twist and shape its way into any form he wishes. It was like a perfect way to display what you could do with this new CGI technology on screen.
Yeah,
And
because I remember some of the demos when they were showing what they could do with computer graphics was a chrome ball that they would morph, and that was just sort of an
exactly.
example. So it makes sense that carries over into what they actually did in the film. So I remember being fascinated with computer graphics when that was new, and it was like, this is amazing. I didn't know, you know, and you're thinking about the applications for animation and other things. And of course, filmmakers are looking at this going, sign me up. Yeah. Because there's just some things you can't do practically, where CGI is the only answer, unless you're literally going to do some sort of a hand-drawn animation. But just,
I'm sure there are some practical effects purists who are
oh, sure.
probably bemoaning the dawn of the CGI era. Like, look, I might even be among them, possibly, but you know, but it what you can't deny how revolutionary it was, and it did essentially change the way special effects were done in these type of movies. Like, it was a real trailblazer for that.
Absolutely. And it's like any other tool. If it's used properly, then it's an enhancement, it's a benefit. The problem with modern cinema, in my opinion, is they rely so heavily on special effects and CGI, they forget to write the damn script. It's like, you got to tell a story first. Don't just give me flash and a whole lot of nothing that looks pretty. Give me a story. And this was a great story. It was well written, and it all stems from the search for John Connor now. They're now directly trying to get John Connor as a child. So the T-1000 is sent back to 1995 to kill the future leader of the human resistance. And of course, the resistance gets wind of this and sends back a less advanced, reprogrammed T-800 to protect John this time. So there's a little twist. When you first see the Terminator in this, you don't know who the bad guy is. You really think it's Arnold again, until that pivotal scene, and you realize, oh, something's different.
and I had watched no trailers or anything like that for this movie, so I was as much in the dark as anybody about who was supposed to be the villain in the opening moments of the movie. I just assumed, like, it hadn't been that long since I'd watched the first film anyway, so I just automatically assumed Arnold was returning as the main villain.
Right. I remember in all the promotional stuff, they only showed Arnold. They never showed the actor who plays the T-1000. And you knew. I don't even remember if they showed Sarah Connor, because that was kind of a surprise when she shows up in the film. And you see, in the first film, she was, a damsel in distress. She was a victim. And by the time you meet her here, you realize she's a wanted fugitive who's been committed. She's considered a terrorist. She's a badass, not just a warrior mother who is trying to, teach her son that he's going to be the future savior of mankind and how to, handle weapons and do everything he's going to have to do. But her future knowledge pretty much drove her nuts, and she's quite unhinged and rather violent, but in a sexy
Oh,
way.
big time. Yeah. Oh, she's absolutely fantastic, and this, like, Linda Hamilton, brilliant actress, and but the character of
Yeah,
Sarah Connor, like, as you mentioned, like how she evolved from what you saw in that first movie to what you see when you actually lay eyes on her in T2. I mean, I think the first shot of her, she's like doing pull-ups in her cell, and then you see
yeah,
these like really muscular arms, and it's like, whoa, what happened to you?
yeah. Total reversal of character. I mean, in the first film, you don't really get much of a sense of her as being anything other than someone who needs to be rescued. But I think even then Cameron had in mind to create this character who, through her horrific adversity she's gone through, she becomes, you know, very similar to, like we see with um, brain just went out, the main character from Alien.
Yes, Alan Ripley.
Thank you. With Ripley, she wasn't so much the victim, but she was just an ordinary crew member. She wasn't anything special. She wasn't, according to some of the early drafts, she wasn't even the one who was meant to survive. But because of having such a really talented actress who really made the role work, we got one of the first real badass females in cinema. And Linda Hamilton definitely follows in that same uh, mold, if you will. She was awesome in this film, and I never saw the other films where they tried to bring her back, because I just kind of given up on the franchise at that point. But no fault of hers, she did great acting. The scripts were the problem, in my opinion. But the main baddie we find is Robert Patrick as the T-1000, and he was a very interesting pick, because he doesn't, you're expecting big bad machine like Arnold was. He's sleek, he's very athletic, he's a runner. I mean, he literally, in some of the film footage, he's running. I think they actually had to have, as an actor, they had to have him slow down so they could get the film to work. He was running faster than what they wanted him to. He was actually catching up with who he was pursuing with the, I think, in the motorcycle scene
That's
when he
right.
was running, which is kind of funny. But you know, he he was kind of an interesting villain in the fact that it's very unassuming. He's cold, he's calculating, but unlike the T-800, he's smart. He can smile. He can interact with people. He's got a better dialect. He can interact with dogs and other things that the T-800 couldn't, which was kind of trippy. Um, when you realize that this policeman was the baddie and not Arnold, how did that affect your mind? Was your mind blown? Were you just like,
Yes, because it's very, like the film really keeps you guessing, especially so you see the moment where the T-1000 is transported to the present day, and he has that encounter with the police officer. Now, from what now, obviously in hindsight, you realize, well, he clearly kills that police officer to acquire his belongings. But when you see it for the very first time, there's a little bit of a struggle. You hear a grunt, and the police officer goes down. You don't know exactly what happens. Like, oh well, maybe he just knocked him out. For all we know, this guy is like another human, like Kyle Reese in the first film. He might not even be a Terminator. It really kept you guessing as to who this guy was and what his intentions are. But once there's a few little giveaways later on, obviously, that he's maybe not quite on the up and up and not your friendly neighborhood police guy who's going to be helping you out. But yes, he's very unassuming. Like you said, he can blend in. He's probably a more efficient infiltration unit in that sense. He could probably go a lot more places than a T-800, especially since, look, if he needs to become a cop, he can become a cop. If he needs to become a doctor, he can enter any facility, assume any form, and then as a result terminate any target that needs to be terminated.
Right.
And I think as well, this kind of just to backtrack a little bit, because we were speaking about how much of an idea maybe James Cameron had for what he was going to do for T2 while he was still doing T1. There was discussion during the making of T1, before Arnold was finally cast as the Terminator, that Lance Henriksen might be cast as the Terminator. And the reasoning behind that would have been that Lance Henriksen is also a fairly unassuming looking dude. He's not very
Very,
well. Yeah,
like
he's just a
an
normal looking type
everyman.
of guy.
Yeah.
And I think Cameron obviously switched gears there when he decided to go with Arnold, but he kept that idea of that unassuming form of the everyman who could just slip by unnoticed. And I think he saved that little seed of an idea for the T1000 later on.
And the line deliveries were so subtle and sophisticated. I mean, you got the idea that this police officer was intense, but he was ominous in some of his eye contact and the way that he delivered his lines. And once it's revealed, you realize why. It's like, oh, he's the Terminator. He is the T-1000. And the liquid metal version was so scary. It's trippy. It was just, you'd never see anything like it. He is considered being composed of liquid metal or mimetic polyalloy nanorobotics. So he's actually a colony of little tiny robots. That's how he functions. It can manipulate itself and assume various forms, including inanimate objects. He doesn't have to take the form of a person. He can be anything that's of relative mass to what he is. He can take the form of, including the freaking floor. That scene always tripped me out. And of course, anything he touches, he can then mimic. So if you walk across the floor and he's the floor, well, it definitely brought a whole new level of horror to what this thing could do. It was further explained in the film's novelization that the T-1000 is created through nanotechnology and is considered a nanomorph. He's able to scan the molecular structure of whatever is touching and visually mimic it. So that's how his abilities work. So they never really explain all that in the film, but they don't need to. You see what's happening and it's like, okay, run now, run fast. But
Terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And the fact as well that he can change form to actually move through barriers. Like, there's that scene where they're escaping the penitentiary or the mental asylum or whatever, and he literally walks through the bars of the cell doors, just
oh
slips
yeah,
right through, and I think his gun gets caught. He has to shimmy his gun out because obviously it can't become
right.
liquid. Just a nice little touch that he can essentially penetrate any defense as well. Like, you're not going to lock yourself in a house and be safe. He'll probably just
Slide
slide right
under.
under the gap in the
Yeah.
door.
I love the little subtle cue there where he's almost confused that he can't get through and he realizes, oh, it's this thing I'm carrying that's not me that's
Yeah,
getting caught. But yeah,
really nice touch.
whereas the T-800 would have had to bash the bars or something, this thing is like there's no keeping me out. So yeah, very, very scary. And that's pretty much the end of the Terminator for me. At the end of T2, the timelines get really weird. Um, and Cameron himself intended for Terminator 2 to be the end of the franchise. He finished the story and explained it. He did the end scene with them on the road and left it to where there was no reason to say anything else. But of course, people love this and wanted to do sequels to the point of absurdity. Just like, I've covered a lot of the classic horror films, and it's kind of the same thing of, the first couple are really good, and then after that, the subsequent sequels just get worse. And so timelines, lots of them. The several timelines begin with after the events of the original Terminator. There were some deviant timelines even then between Terminator and T2 that are covered in some of the other media we'll talk about. There's also the T2 trilogy, which is a series of books we'll talk about. The new John Connor Chronicles, which I'm not going to talk about. The Sarah Connor Chronicles, I'm not going to talk about. Rise of the Machines, Dark Fate. And there was even a timeline where Judgment Day never even happened. So that's the one bright future that we never see, but they mentioned, oh yeah, that's an alternate timeline too. So, yeah. So what I will cover are the ones that directly tie into the first two films. And for those who remember, Universal Studios did a 3D ride called T2 3D Battle Across Time, and it was pretty cool. If you went to Universal Studios, I think it was just like 1 or 2 years after the film came out. It was pretty close, because that was a trend in amusement parks. Disney had done that with Captain EO, and then the Star Tours. The idea of blending cinema and 3D effects with a ride was a new thing. And of course, Universal Studios did this with Back to the Future and a few other of their properties. But the T2 one was really, really cool. And from what I understand, if you didn't get to actually go and experience the ride itself at the park, you could still see the film. Where did you first see
Right.
this?
I first watched it on, I believe it was on a special features disc of a T2 special edition that was probably released around 2002, 2003. If anybody is interested, though, I am pretty sure you will find all the footage on YouTube. I think I ran into it not so long ago, and it's good quality. So if you want the gist of the story of what's happening in that ride, because there was a, like you've so well put together here, like they did make a genuine effort to bring in as much from the actual movie into the ride as possible when it came to actually having the actors return, and even like the special effects and the whole setup for the future war environment. Like it's, you can tell there was a lot of work put into it. It wasn't just some, all right, let's just cash in and make a Terminator themed ride. Like they actually made a genuine effort to make sure that anybody who was going to go and attend this was going to be immersed in that world and get a true experience as if you actually were living the story of the movie. So
Right.
it's really impressive what they managed to pull off.
It's produced as if it's an addendum to the second film. I mean, you have Arnold there, you have Edward Furlong as John Connor. You also have I keep forgetting his name, the guy that played the T-1000,
Robert Patrick.
Robert Patrick. He comes back and makes an appearance as the T-1000, chasing you down, and it's pretty well done. I thought it was pretty cool, so I mentioned it here. And there is even a toy tie-in to this. We'll mention in a minute. Another great resource, if you're like me and you just want to stick to the first two films, is the T2 trilogy. You want more Terminator, but you don't want to go down the path of what they did in the films. Check out these three books. It's a series of novels written by S.M. Sterling, who some people might know from some of his other sci-fi and fantasy writings, set in after the events of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And these were first published in 2001. They are still available, and this is actually one of the first official continuations of the franchise before anything else was done. So it definitely ties in with everything that we love about those first two films. And there's three books: Infiltrator, Rising Storm, and Future War. Future War is probably my favorite because it literally goes into the resistance with John Connor and everything that goes on after Judgment Day, and fighting the machine, everything that leads up to the events of the first Terminator film. But all three are good and highly recommended.
I must actually track these down and give them a read. I was aware of them, but I just never got round to reading them. So it's something I like, knowing that there's actually media out there that's good,
Yeah,
that's come out already, that I can actually go back now and track down. So yeah, that's going on the list, definitely.
yeah, I highly recommend these, as I do the Dark Horse comics, which you are more familiar with than I. I know you've
Yeah,
been doing some reading on the omnibus, which,
right.
unlike Dark Horse's Alien and Predator and some other stuff, this one isn't as there's not as much content, but there's just enough.
Yeah, I think I think they recognized, as in I think Dark Horse recognized that, with T1, and then especially after T2 came out, they are kind of a perfect story in a nutshell. You don't really need to expand on them too much to get the most out of them. So, um, yeah, definitely, like you were saying, in comparison to Alien, Predator, there's just not as much material written in the comics as those other franchises. But what is written is of a high quality, and it does a really good job, especially the first few releases that they did, of following pretty much covering the gap in between T1 and T2, and giving us a few things that were probably, I don't want to use the word stolen, but let's say maybe inspired some of the less liked sequels later on down the line. Like, for example, in the first Dark Horse Terminator comic, I believe that's the first time a female Terminator is introduced.
Mm.
They also have a character that's half human, half Terminator, which I believe was an idea
Hmm.
taken for Terminator Salvation. And I
Right.
can tell you now, folks, if you have watched Terminator Salvation and didn't like it, but did like the idea maybe of a half human, half Terminator, read that comic instead. They do a much better job of of teasing out that concept. But yeah, no, really good stories, really solid, keeps in this kind of vibe and general tone of the first two movies. And like we were saying, it's a short run, but it's a sweet run. If they don't outstay their welcome, and if anybody is looking to pick them up, Dark Horse released two volumes, two omnibuses, and they're out there for anybody who wants to read them. And I would recommend reading them, especially if you're someone who was disillusioned, shall we say, with the latter day or more modern Terminator sequels. If you want some good material, hit the comics.
Right. So a lot of these were written in that time period in between Terminator and T2. And because they were wise in how they did the storyline, nothing conflicts with the canon of the films. It flows really well. And it's actually a great story that could fit in between the two films and could have been a film itself in the way that they did it. So
Easily.
definitely worth picking up. Great artwork, great storytelling. So the only other media that was a good tie-in to the first two films were some video games. There were some earlier, like I think there was a Nintendo game that was god awful and some other stuff. The first decent game that I remember was Dawn of Fate, and this was on the PlayStation 2. This is where you saw the T500s, very, like we said, very Silent-esque. You shoot a lot of these up. There's a decent storyline. Again, it fits well with what came from the first two films, and it's worth checking out. I don't know if this is on Steam or how it might be available today, but I'm sure you could play it if you wanted to. I'm not a big gamer, so I'm not sure how old games are still made available these days.
I
I'd have
always
to
think
ask.
it's a good sign when you look at the cover of that game and you see that the font is done in a similar style to the first two movies. that in itself gives you a good idea of the tone of the
Yes.
game. You know, these guys were obviously interested in the material from its source, as opposed to trying to venture into crazy territory.
Yeah. I found it interesting that Atari developed this because at that point, this is 2002. There wasn't much left of Atari. They'd kind of gone by the wayside, but did a great job on this. And the only other video game tie-in that I would probably recommend is the newer one, came out in 2019, called Terminator Resistance. Very cinematic. It is a first-person shooter developed by Teon, published by Reef Entertainment. It's available on PS4, Windows, Xbox One. I think it's available on Steam now. You gamers out there can correct me because I don't know. But what I know of the storyline in it, it is set during the original future war depicted from Terminator and T2, where they talk about what came before, well, where Kyle Reese came from. It's set in that reality, and you are a resistance fighter, and you're working either directly for John Connor or one of his splinter cells. And there are future patches in the game where you can flip sides and you can actually play an infiltrator. You can be a T-800 fighting against the resistance. So there's a lot of replay value. There are multiple endings to this game depending on how you play, what story you get. So if you're into gaming and you like the Terminator, the first two films, this is worth checking out because they pretty much ignore everything else and just stick to that. So
That's going on my list. That's all I needed to hear.
there you go. This is more my ballywick as the toys. I never got much in the video games, but I really enjoyed. These were everywhere, especially after the second film. Only after the second film. There wasn't any tie-in with the first Terminator film for toys because it was an R-rated film. It wasn't meant to be for kids. But it was so popular, they definitely decided to add merchandising to T2. And it was, again, it's that strange hybrid like RoboCop, like Terminator, like Alien, like Predator. They found a way to market this to kids, even though kids weren't old enough to officially watch the film. Here it is.
Key word there being officially.
Yes,
and I think I mentioned this briefly in our Alien and Predators discussion before. I genuinely do think that there was an unspoken acknowledgement, shall we say, from Kenner and these other toy companies that kids were seeing these movies and would be aware of who the characters were and what they were about. So they knew that they could get away with selling us these toys. They definitely knew we had seen what they were selling.
And especially with the proliferation of, video game or video store rentals where you could pick up anything and watch it at home. And then, cable services showing, recently run or big blockbuster films, piped right into your house. It changed the market definitely. And as you say, a lot of kids were exposed to films they wouldn't have been able to see in the theater. And Terminator 2 is definitely one of those. Didn't hurt that one of the primary characters is a kid in the film. So that's a good tie-in. The toys were not terrible. I mean, it was Kenner. They did some good stuff. They were a little clunky. They didn't have great articulation, but at that time, it was good for what was out there. You had a couple like this Arnie where you could have the blowaway face and have the Terminator body underneath, which was kind of a neat one. There's a few others. Let me see if I can pull up some other images here. The ones I remember really being popular were these. Did you ever see any of these in Ireland?
I did see them in the shops, but I never had any of the play sets or vehicles. I did have a few of the figures. I always wanted this BioFlash regenerator set. I still remember actually watching the ads on TV and just being blown away.
Oh yeah,
just the idea that you could put your own skin on an endoskeleton, that just blew my mind.
Yeah, total gimmick, but so cool. One of my neighbors had this, and it was fun to play with. You got an actual endoskeleton that looked pretty cool, And yeah, you put him in the mold, you put this, gooey flesh stuff on him, and then, give him some battle damage. And it was fun. Excuse me.
That's
The
kids to keep buying tubs of,
Yes, the tubs.
flashy goo.
Yeah, gotta replace the goo. Um, the motorcycle, obviously that was an iconic scene when Arnold's on that big bike. The toy was a bit goofy. They added a missile firing feature, which was totally unnecessary, and put a big old T on it. So just in case you didn't know, this is for the Terminator. It's like, really? But it was fun anyway. There were basically three flavors of the toys from Kenner. There was the ones that were direct tie-ins to T2, including a glow-in-the-dark endoskeleton, which was really kind of nifty. They did tie-ins to the 3D Universal Ride, where they re-released some of the toys that they had released previously. A couple repaints. I don't remember if there were any new figures in that or not. I think they were just re-releases with a new card back. And then they did a new line called Future War, where they did add a couple of new figures with gimmicks. Everything had to have a missile for some reason. That was a big thing. Giant missiles that made no sense, but they fired.
Have to
Yay.
include a choking hazard warning on the toy, so you justify it by putting a spring-loaded missile included.
That's it. It was a thing.
I do remember the Future War branding in particular was all over the shops here. Strangely enough, they seem to be. It must have been the same year, maybe, but Last Action Hero figures seem to be sold alongside them a lot. I distinctly remember walking into the toy shop and seeing a row of Terminator and then a row of Last Action Hero. So you had your two Arnold Schwarzenegger properties staring you in the face when you walked in the
Right.
shop.
Ironically, there is a little Easter egg in Last Action Hero where Robert Patrick, I believe.
Right.
I can't remember his name to save my life. It's that Swiss cheese memory acting up. He actually is in the film in a police uniform, and he walks in the background, and the kid who's with Arnold, he's like, "Isn't that?" And of course, Arnold's character Jack just totally ignores, whatever. But it was
Nice
just a fun
moment.
little,
And
yeah,
there's that other moment where you see when they go to the VHS rental store and you see a kind of poster in the background and it's Sylvester Stallone in Terminator
yes,
2, Judgment Day as the lead character. Nice little
yeah.
egg there
Little,
too.
that was a fun movie. If you haven't seen Last Action Hero, totally unrelated but fun. It's just good popcorn cinema, and a lot of Easter eggs in there for other films. So including Terminator. So worth checking out. Then NECA, many years later, 2019, they did an homage to the Kenner figures, and they did an endoskeleton that wasn't terrible. It didn't stand up very well. And of course, early NECA stuff was notoriously brittle. They broke easy. God forbid they fall off the shelf, it would shatter. Did you ever have any of the NECAs?
Yeah, I have a few of them, and I believe it or not, I bought multiples of these endoskeletons with the intention of doing a bit of an army build. I actually only have one that is still in decent enough condition to actually even just stand up and be displayed. They break
Oh,
so
yeah,
easily, and they have so many little moving parts attached to them, like they have little pistons to move the legs and
right.
the arms that are all separate pieces. So when that thing falls, if one of those breaks off and goes under the sofa, like
It's
that's it,
done.
you're done. It ain't
Yeah.
standing up anymore. So
To, to, Ne-
I
to
have
NECA's
kept them.
credit,
I'm going to chop them up and use them as custom fodder, I think,
oh, there
eventually.
you go. Yeah, you can always have, the bits of them scattered about in the as the resistance blows them up. But to NECA's credit, they did a good job on the sculpt. It looks just like the film. It's just the plastic they used and the intricacy of the pistons made it way too delicate, and it just does not hold up. They did some other ones. They did Arnie in his T2 leather, and the sculpts are decent. They look good. I they're just a bit brittle. They have
Yeah.
gotten better with their plastic on some of their newer stuff. I kind of wish they would re-release some of these with newer techniques, but never fear, Mofex is here. This is one I reviewed a few months ago, and I really love it. This is, Arnold from about midway in the film when he's got the leather jacket and uh, great likeness, and of course you've got his cyborg mode where he's kind of uh, had some of his infiltrator flesh chewed off, looking really gnarly. As you can see, all three head sculpts come with it. Highly recommend. It's still available. I think you can still get this at Big Bad. I think they still have it for sale if you really want it. If you're more into the T2 style, these are coming up. They are on pre-order right now with Big Bad and some of the other stores out there. Hobby Link Japan, a few other places are advertising these. The Battle Damaged is supposed to come out in August of this year, and that's one where his arm's been chewed off, and this was towards the end of the film. Ironically, that's the one that they're releasing first, and then in November they'll come out with the pristine version of the T2 T800, where he's just in his badass motorcycle outfit with all the accoutrements. So if you prefer T2 Arnie, it's coming. If you like T1, it's already out. And of course, the one I'm waiting for, this one, is also scheduled to come out in February of next year. Of course, if you've ever bought Mafex, their schedules are subject to change. So it might be a wee bit further down the road than February, but they are soliciting pre-orders for this right now. And it is a beautiful model. From the quality of the Mafex figures I already have, I'm hoping this one will be a much better rendition than what NECA did. It'll be true 1/12 scale. And as you can see, it's very intricate. It looks just like the Stan Winston model that he built. So, and even comes with the nasty pulse rifle from the future. So,
I really want this one. I definitely,
yeah.
I'm going to try my best to pick this one up.
I think it's definitely worth putting on the shelf if you can afford it. They are spendy, but really, really well done. And I believe that brings us to the end of our slides. But he'll be back in one form or another. They always bring them back, hopefully with some better scripts in the future. But for our purposes, T1 and T2 is where it's at. And I'm happy leaving it there, except for the few pieces of media that we talked about today. Was there anything I missed? Was there any other tie-ins that you enjoyed?
I think we pretty much hit all the bases there. Now I know I suppose when we were in the embryonic stages of deciding to have this discussion, there was originally a possibility of us doing an actual RoboCop and Terminator a look at those, because there was quite a bit of crossover, especially in the 90s. They released a couple of games and some comic books, and I believe there was even talk in the early 90s of doing a RoboCop and Terminator movie, but it just never came to fruition. As far as other Terminator crossovers, there is a lot of just general, like everything else, everything's being done. They've done Aliens versus Predator versus Terminator.
Oh, yeah.
Also Painkiller Jane versus Terminator. There's a ton of stuff. Anybody who's interested, just go on to Wikipedia. You'll see the long list of Terminator crossovers. But in terms of keeping it pure and keeping it to the core material, T1 and T2 is where it's at.
True. There is and I think it's still on YouTube. There is a short animated piece where it's a crossover with Batman and Terminator, and it's a fun watch. It's only like maybe 8 minutes, but really well done. Just kind of a little venue or a vignette story of if the Bat in Gotham had been taken over by Skynet, what would the Resistance look like?
Strangely enough, my most recent Instagram picture that I did was actually the Keaton Batman from McFarlane Toys fighting the NECA T800 endoskeleton. So it must have been in my mind, Batman and the Terminator. The Batman animated series actually did a really good episode called Heart of Steel that has very Terminator-esque themes to it. So I'd recommend that to anybody who's interested.
I'd forgotten about that one, but you're right. The was it Hardak, the computer that creates a duplicate of the Bat. Yeah,
It's like,
very
what would happen
Terminator.
if you took, Hal from 2001 Space Odyssey and gave him the ability to make Terminators?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great one. And you're right. There is a definite homage to Terminator in that. So, what I would suggest, Mark, let's do a RoboCop down the road, and we can talk about some of those tie-ins there because there's not as much RoboCop. Well, I don't know. I mean, there's the three films that were pretty good, and then there's a lot of tie-ins. But yeah, we can cover some of the crossover stuff there when we do RoboCop. What do you say to that?
Sounds like a plan.
Cool.
To be continued.
Yes, to be continued. But this has been a great episode. We've done a good hour on our Terminator, our baddie for this episode. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it is a list of some of our favorite stuff. Tell us what some of your stuff is a favorite in the Terminator franchise. Maybe you could change my mind about some of the other films. Probably not likely, but I'll listen to any argument. Put it in the comments. Again, thanks for your time, Boba Hicks. Check out his rantings and ravings on YouTube and Instagram and all the other places in the interwebs where he pops up now and then. It's always fun, and I enjoy hanging out with you. One of my favorites to have on these type of shows to bounce ideas back and forth on. We'll definitely delve into some other rabbit holes in pop culture in the future. But thank you for hanging out today and
Thank you for having me. I
appreciate it. We will sign off for now, but we will see all of you sometime in the very near future. And don't forget, monsters need love too.